Imagine the Carolina coast, autumn of 1714. The tide is low, fog curling across black water like a living thing, and somewhere in that suffocating silence a ship waits. Not a ship of trade, not a ship of war, a ship that breathes dread into every plank of its deck. Its captain is not here for gold, nor for silver, nor even the fleeting thrill of violence. He is here for you. 42 colonists were taken, not slaughtered, not ransomed, taken, each one chosen with the precision of a surgeon dissecting a body. He examined their teeth. He pressed his ear to their chests. He tested their reflexes as if life itself were an experiment, and they were nothing more than raw material. Witnesses remembered his journal, a leather-bound book, inked with measurements and sketches, and they swore his hand shook not from fear, but from excitement. This man, Captain Ezekiel Thorne, had once been a healer. The archives of the Royal Navy speak of him with awe. He stitched torn flesh that no other surgeon dared touch. He saved sailors from amputations that would have ended their lives. Some whispered his methods bordered on sorcery. Keeping men alive long after death should have claimed them. But somewhere between the Spanish Main and the Carolina coast, that healer broke. He became something else, something darker. For 300 years, the truth of what happened to those 42 souls was buried. Colonial governors silenced witnesses. Families were told lies, shipwrecks, raids, fevers, all to conceal a horror that ran deeper than piracy, deeper than war, deeper even than death itself. Because Thorne wasn't stealing bodies for money. He was harvesting them for knowledge, forbidden knowledge. Knowledge meant to outlast kingdoms and religions, to bend life itself to the will of a man. And here's the part you were never meant to hear. Fragments of his journal survived, smuggled through monasteries in Spain, hidden in British archives, whispered of in Cuban taverns. They describe procedures not found in any medical text of the 18th century. Procedures still too dangerous for the 21st. Before I take you deeper into this abyss, I need you to join the circle of the initiated. Subscribe now, and in the comments, tell me where you are watching from. Because as you descend with me, place matters. History is never neutral, and to those ready to walk this path, comment this phrase twice: the sea remembers. It will lock you into the identity you'll need for what comes next. The Carolina coast in 1714 was no place for innocence. The air itself carried fever. The swamps breathed disease, and every shadow on the water might conceal a raider's sail. Colonists who crossed an ocean to escape Europe's hunger and tyranny found themselves trapped in a different crucible. One forged from piracy, war, and the endless struggle to tame a land that did not wish to be tamed. Yet even in this cauldron, what Captain Thorne brought was different. His raids were not chaos. They were precision. He did not burn homes or pillage churches. He did not shout drunken threats or wave bloodied cutlasses. His men moved like soldiers drilled under a hidden command, silent and efficient. At plantations, fishing villages, lumber camps, they arrived with the fog, and when they left, the chosen were gone. Always the young, the strong, the untainted. Those without scars, those whose bodies spoke of vitality. What unsettled survivors most was not the violence. It was the examination. Witnesses described the way Thorne touched their faces, measured the width of their hands, and demanded answers about family sicknesses. He would dismiss the weak with a wave, but when he found a candidate, his eyes lit with a hunger more terrifying than any blade. And consider this: Thorne left behind words, not threats, not boasts, but proclamations that rattled even the most hardened overseers. He told them their people would serve a cause that would benefit mankind. He told them sacrifice was a step toward unlocking life itself. These are not the words of a pirate. These are the words of a man possessed by purpose. The colonial government scrambled for explanations. Some whispered Thorne was building a hidden colony. Others swore he was trafficking in slaves for a market too secret for the Spanish, too hidden even for the Ottoman ports. But those who saw him closely said otherwise. They said his gaze was not the gaze of a merchant, but of a scientist, and the evidence supports it. At abandoned camps along barrier islands, searchers discovered instruments, surgical instruments of designs unknown to even the most trained physicians of London. Bone saws curved in unnatural ways, forceps crafted for purposes not yet understood, and wooden tables stained with blood, arranged not for butchery, but for procedure. Something had awakened in Ezekiel Thorne. something darker than greed, deeper than cruelty. He was no longer a healer, nor even a pirate. He was becoming a priest of an unholy science. The story of Ezekiel Thorne cannot be separated from the age that birthed him. Europe in the early 18th century was obsessed with progress. Anatomy theaters filled with paying spectators, surgeons dissecting corpses by candlelight as churchmen debated whether such acts damned the soul. Empires hungered for knowledge as much as for gold, and in that hunger, men like Thorne were forged. He had once been celebrated. Naval records describe his uncanny ability to preserve life, saving sailors whose injuries should have consigned them to watery graves. He performed amputations with such speed that men survived shock. He stitched wounds with a technique that baffled his peers. Admirals called him indispensable. But whispers followed him too, that he lingered over the dying, that he recorded the rhythm of their breath as they crossed the threshold, that he asked questions no ordinary surgeon dared to ask. When the War of Spanish Succession ended, countless sailors found themselves discarded, their skills unwanted. Many turned to piracy, but Thorne's transformation was stranger. Somewhere in the disease-ridden waters of the Caribbean, he abandoned healing and embraced experimentation. It was as though he had concluded that true mastery over life required not saving it, but rebuilding it. By the time he appeared on the Carolina coast, he was no longer merely a pirate surgeon, he was a collector. His journal, fragments of which survive in scattered archives, speaks in riddles. Subjects demonstrate resilience under stress beyond expectation. The pulse, when observed during controlled trauma, reveals secrets of unseen systems. Replication may require at least 42 bodies for viable result. Do you see it? He wasn't stealing prisoners. He was assembling a pattern. Every raid brought him closer to a number, a threshold, a critical mass of human material. And when the count reached 42, he vanished, taking his captives into a darkness from which no trace returned. The authorities responded with their usual deception. Colonial officials classified documents, buried testimonies, and told grieving families that their loved ones were lost at sea. It was easier than admitting they could not control the coast, that a man with knowledge greater than their own had slipped past their defenses. Easier than admitting that science itself had turned predatory. But the silence of governments is never proof of absence. It is proof of fear, and fear always points toward truth. Picture the scene: a Carolina shoreline at dusk, 1714. The horizon bleeds red as the sun sinks, and from the marshes rises the mist that locals called the breath of the dead. It is in this atmosphere that Ezekiel Thorne moved unseen. Villagers later swore they could hear bells before his ship appeared. Faint, metallic chimes drifting over the water, as if announcing not a raid, but a ritual. This was no random plundering. Survivors noticed a pattern in the abductions. Thorne favored men of seafaring age, women of sturdy frame, and youths just entering their prime. He ignored children, he ignored the old. His choices echoed a surgeon selecting specimens, not a pirate stocking slaves. And when he took them aboard, he promised something chilling. You will become more than human. You will become necessary. Think about that. Necessary. To what? To whom? The colonial authorities never answered. They couldn't, because answering would have meant admitting that the boundaries between faith, science, and heresy had already been breached. For what is more terrifying than a man of medicine who no longer heals but repurposes? At an abandoned inlet near Ocracoke, searchers found more evidence. Glass jars containing organs suspended in brine, carefully labeled in Thorne's neat script. Lungs marked with notes on capacity. Hearts annotated with resilience under strain. To the farmers and fishermen who stumbled upon these objects, they were blasphemies. To modern eyes, they are glimpses into early experiments on the mechanics of the body. Experiments that official history swears did not occur until centuries later. And here lies the hook, the question I now turn on you. Do you believe Thorne was insane, a madman lost to obsession? Or do you believe he was ahead of his time, a man who glimpsed truths the world was not ready to face? Comment your answer below, and let's see how many of you dare to step into his shadow, because the tale does not end with missing villagers or scattered artifacts. No, it grows darker. For the number 42, the count of his captives was not random. It was the key, A number he referenced again and again in his fragmented journals, a number tied to cycles, to stars, to calculations that made no sense to the farmers of Carolina, but may have meant everything to Thorne's vision. 42 was not the end. It was the beginning. Numbers are not random in the minds of visionaries or the minds of the damned. Ezekiel Thorne's fixation on 42 was not the babbling of a lunatic. It was deliberate, inscribed over and over in his fragmented journal, scratched into the wood of his ship's captain's quarters, even burned into the lid of a crate that once carried surgical tools. Why 42? The answer depends on how deep you're willing to look. In biblical numerology, 42 represents judgment. It is the number tied to destruction, to the fall of kingdoms. In the book of Kings, 42 children are mauled by bears for mocking a prophet. Coincidence? Or was Thorne drawing power from the most terrifying symbol he could find? To mathematicians, 42 appears again and again in sequences governing the harmony of the heavens. To ancient mystics, it was a number of transition, the crossing point between mortal and divine. And to Ezekiel Thorne, it was something more. His writings speak of the lattice of veins aligning with the lattice of stars, of subjects becoming stable only when the cycle of 42 is complete. Do you feel the chill of that? He wasn't merely counting captives. He was calibrating them. Each body added to his tally was another step in a grim equation. An equation designed to unlock a transformation no colony, no empire, no church would have sanctioned. Some historians claim he was chasing immortality. Others argue he sought to assemble the perfect sailor, a crew immune to pain, fatigue, or death itself. But there is a third possibility, the one authorities still deny, the one they seal in archives marked, never to be released, that he wasn't trying to build life at all. He was trying to summon it. Imagine the prisoners shackled in his hold, hearing the scrape of knives, the rattle of jars, the low hum of a man who believed he was closer to truth than any king or priest. Imagine their terror as they realized they weren't captives of a pirate, but of a surgeon priest, a man of scalpel and scripture, carving not for plunder, but for revelation. And when the count reached 42, when the number was complete, he and his prisoners disappeared into the night. No wreckage, no bones, no graves, only silence. But silence can be the loudest answer of all. History is written by the victors, but whispers are carried by the terrified. Before Ezekiel Thorne vanished, there were those who claimed to see glimpses of what he was attempting. Their testimonies, scattered across court records and private letters, paint a picture more disturbing than any official chronicle dared preserve. One farmer near Pamlico Sound swore he saw figures moving along the shoreline late at night. Not sailors, not soldiers, but tall, stiff shapes that walked with an unnatural rhythm, as if their joints bent at wrong angles. He said they moved in silence, yet their shadows seemed to twitch independently, lagging a half-second behind their bodies. He fled before they noticed him, but he carried that vision to his grave. Another account came from a fisherman who claimed he was dragged aboard Thorne's vessel after being caught in one of its nets. He escaped by leaping into the Sound during a storm. His words were wild, fevered, but consistent. They were not men anymore. Their eyes were glass, their breath shallow, their skin marked with symbols that glowed when the lightning struck. His description was dismissed as hysteria, yet the details echoed the farmers. Then came the letter. A colonial missionary wrote home to England of his dread after visiting a coastal village where Thorne had lingered. He described hearing wails from the swamps at night, not of wolves, not of owls, but of something between the two. The cries of souls neither fully alive nor fully damned. The missionary begged to be reassigned inland. His request was granted. He never spoke of Thorne again. Were these hallucinations, superstitions, or were they the first sightings of whatever Thorne was constructing from his 42 chosen bodies? Pause and consider this. 42 men and women entered his hold, shackled, terrified, still human. None were ever seen again in recognizable form. What if the eyewitnesses weren't seeing phantoms at all? What if they were glimpsing the prisoners, reshaped, reassembled, and loosed upon the Carolina marshes as proof of Thorne's experiment? Think on that as you listen to the next part, because the vanishing itself, the night his ship and captives slipped from the face of the earth, was not an accident of tide or storm. It was the culmination. The night of Ezekiel Thorne's disappearance was not calm. The Carolina coast was alive with violence, the kind of storm sailors called a devil's tide. Thunder rolled like cannon fire, lightning carved the sea into molten shards, and the wind drove waves so high they swallowed entire skiffs. But amidst the chaos, there were sightings. Witnesses along the shoreline reported a glow offshore. Not lightning, not lanterns, but flames. A pillar of fire rising from the deck of Thorne's vessel, yet the ship did not burn. It floated steady against the storm, as if the laws of sea and sky no longer touched it. Some said they heard bells ringing across the water, but not ship bells. These were too many, too layered, like a cathedral tolling in unison with 100 unseen towers. The sound rolled across the marshes, rattling windows, stirring livestock into frenzy. Children screamed in their beds, claiming they saw faces at their windows, faces wet and pale, watching, waiting. Then came the silence. Not the hush after thunder, but a void. Eyewitnesses swore the waves stopped. The rain slowed, and for a span of heartbeats the entire coast held its breath. In that silence, one fisherman claimed he saw the prisoners, all 42, standing at the rail of the ship, but their eyes reflected no light. Their mouths opened, yet no sound escaped. They stared toward the shore as if summoned, as if bound to something greater than their chains. When the next lightning bolt struck, the ship was gone. No wreckage, no bodies, no trace. Only charred foam on the water and a stench of sulfur that clung to the shoreline for days. The colonial authorities declared it a wreck. Pirates lost at sea, another casualty of the coast. But locals whispered otherwise. They spoke of the fire that did not consume, of bells that had no source, of prisoners who stood not as captives, but as an assembly. And so the legend began. Thorne had not perished. He had crossed. He had led his 42 into the storm, not to die, but to transform, leaving behind no ship, no bones, only questions that deepened with every retelling. But here's where the story grows darker still. Because disappearance is one thing, reappearance is another. The disappearance of Ezekiel Thorne and his 42 captives should have been the end. A storm at sea, a vanished ship, a tragic loss. But the whispers did not die with the waves. They stretched forward through the years, crossing oceans and centuries, resurfacing when the world least expected. In 1769, 5 years after Thorne's ship vanished, a British frigate off Jamaica reported a strange encounter. Its lookout swore a vessel appeared from the fog, a brig with torn sails yet moving swiftly against the wind. Lanterns flickered along its deck, but no crew worked the rigging. When the captain raised his glass, he froze. Standing at the rail were dozens of figures, unmoving, their eyes black as pitch. The frigate fired a warning shot. The vessel dissolved into mist before the cannon smoke cleared. The captain refused to log the event, but sailors told the tale in every tavern from Port Royal to Bristol. Again in 1803, a Spanish galleon bound for Havana stumbled upon what survivors called a ghost convoy. At its lead, a weather-beaten brig, the same ship Thorne had last sailed. Witnesses described prisoners still shackled at the ankles, yet walking the deck with fluid grace, as though chains had become ornaments rather than restraints. The Spaniards claimed the ship's bell tolled in their ears for days after the vision, even as they slept. But the strangest accounts came from inland. In 1842, settlers along the Neuse River in North Carolina claimed to hear bells during a storm, identical to the ones reported the night Thorne vanished. Some swore they saw spectral figures moving through the pines, dripping wet as if they had just risen from the sound. One family abandoned their homestead overnight, leaving behind food still on the table. By the 20th century, the legend had mutated into something larger. Lighthouse keepers along the eastern seaboard swapped tales of a black-eyed crew seen in the fog. Fishermen spoke of nets pulled up not with fish, but with rusted shackles coated in fresh salt. Navy sonar operators reported ghost echoes, ships where no ships were. Every reappearance was fleeting, never long enough to capture, but always enough to terrify. The suggestion was clear: Thorne and his 42 were not dead. They were still moving, still searching, their vessel no longer bound to time or tide. And here's the question you must ask yourself: if they can appear anywhere, at any time, what exactly are they looking for? The reappearances were not random. That is what few dared to admit aloud. because patterns, once traced across centuries, tell a story no official archive dares to record. The sightings of Ezekiel Thorne's phantom crew always occurred along the same stretch of latitude, a ghostly corridor running from the Carolina coast to the islands of the Caribbean. Not everywhere, not aimless, always within a band of sea tied to Thorne's last known course. Historians call it coincidence, superstition, but locals whispered a harsher truth. The crew was searching, not for freedom, not for treasure, but for something lost the night they vanished. What could anchor a cursed company to the waters for over 200 years? Theories multiplied like barnacles. Some believed the prisoners carried with them a chest of Spanish silver, cursed plunder hidden in the brig, meant to be ransomed once they reached shore. Others whispered of a relic aboard Thorne's ship, a carved idol stolen from a West African slaver, an object said to carry the weight of ancestral wrath. When the storm struck, the idol's curse bound not only Thorne, but every soul aboard. Yet the most chilling theory comes from a document buried deep in the archives of Charleston. A deposition from one of the jailers who loaded the prisoners. He claimed that among the 42 men chained in the hold, one was no ordinary pirate. He was a priest of some forgotten order, seized during a raid in the Caribbean. His tongue was cut so he could not speak, but when he prayed with his eyes, the other captives bowed. What if the storm was not a storm at all? What if it was a summoning? The bells, the fire, the silence, all signs not of nature, but of ritual. The idea chills the blood because it reframes every sighting since. Thorne and his crew are not wandering, they are hunting, not for gold, not for land, but for the missing piece of a ritual never finished. A key, a relic, a name, and here lies the terror. If they find it, their wandering ends, but so does ours. What if Ezekiel Thorne did not perish in the storm? What if he did not drown or rot or crumble into the sea like so many forgotten men of his trade? What if the night of his disappearance was not his ending, but his ascension? Maritime folklore treats Thorne as the doomed captain of a cursed voyage. But listen closer to the fragments of testimony scattered across time, and another image emerges, not of a man destroyed by fate, but of a man who mastered it. Several reports describe the phantom ship's deck in unsettling detail. Among the black-eyed crew, one figure stands apart, taller, commanding, cloaked not in rags but in a long coat that never seems to fray. Witnesses claim his eyes burn not with emptiness, but with a pale, spectral fire. Some say he never moves his lips, yet his men obey, as if their chains were no longer forged of iron but of will. Is this Ezekiel Thorne, or something that wears his face? One diary, written in 1821 by a fisherman out of Beaufort, describes the encounter in chilling words. The captain stood at the helm, and the sea parted as if afraid. His crew were shadows bound to him, each shackled not by iron but by devotion. When he turned his gaze upon me, I knew. He was not steering the vessel was steering the sea. If this is true, then Thorne did not merely survive. He became something else, something that transcended the human limits of a pirate, a prisoner, a man. His ship was no longer wood and canvas but an ark of torment, and his crew, the 42, were no longer prisoners but eternal soldiers in his service. Think about it. What other captain in history commands a crew that cannot die? What admiral could boast a fleet that sails through centuries? Nations rise, empires collapse, but Ezekiel Thorne sails on, and the pattern of appearances suggests intent. Each sighting edges closer to land, closer to settlements, closer to those who still whisper his name. If Thorne ascended into something beyond death, then every foggy night, every tolling bell is not just a haunting, it is a summons. The captain is not lost, he is waiting. If Ezekiel Thorne truly ascended, if his crew truly became bound spirits rather than broken men, then the question is no longer where did they go, but why do they return? And the most sinister belief whispers a truth that chills the blood. They are not drifting aimlessly through centuries, they are hunting bloodlines. You see, in Charleston's colonial court records lies a forgotten trial transcript, yellowed paper, ink half faded, that names not only Thorne, but every single one of the 42 prisoners taken with him. And just as clearly, it lists the magistrates, the jailers, the guards, even the clerks who processed them before shipment. Names that once carried authority, now buried beneath family trees that stretch into the present. Imagine this. The men who condemned Ezekiel Thorne to chains thought they had rid themselves of pirates forever. But what if Thorne's curse preserved memory sharper than any archive? What if his crew's loyalty now binds them to a mission of vengeance? A mission that passes silently across generations. This explains the disturbing consistency of the sightings. When Thorne's ghostly vessel nears shore, it does not choose at random. Look closely at the maps, and you see a pattern. The sightings cluster near towns and villages where descendants of those original officials still live. A magistrate's line in Wilmington, a jailer's line in Charleston, a clerk's line in Savannah, and in every instance oral history records, vanishings. In those families, unexplained disappearances, sailors who never returned, sons lost at sea though they never set foot on a ship. Coincidence? Or the slow, relentless work of a captain repaying a debt across time? Think of the horror this implies. Thorne does not need to sack a port or raid a fleet. He does not wage war against nations. His vengeance is precise, surgical, inevitable. He does not kill for treasure. He reclaims souls, the way his was stolen, binding them to his endless voyage. And here lies the deeper terror, if you trace your lineage to the colonial coast. If your blood carries the mark of those courts, how can you ever be certain the tolling you hear at night is not for you? Because the crew of Ezekiel Thorne does not forget, and they do not forgive. For centuries, skeptics scoffed at the legend of Ezekiel Thorne. But what happens when the same pattern of disappearances begins to repeat itself? Not in 1714, but in our own age. What happens when the newspapers of the 20th and 21st centuries echo the same story written 300 years ago? The U.S. Coast Guard files are full of reports stamped, unexplained. Fishing boats that radio in calm seas and clear skies, only to vanish without distress calls. Yachts found adrift with meals half-eaten and no crew aboard. Even naval cadets on training exercises who mark their positions, then never report again. Take 1937, off the Carolina coast. The fishing trawler Meridian was discovered circling aimlessly. Its nets were hauled, its engines still humming, but the 6-man crew was gone. Locals whispered they had been taken. When investigators interviewed surviving relatives, one detail chilled them. The captain of the Meridian was a direct descendant of a colonial jailer who had once overseen Thorne's imprisonment. Then there's 1962, the case of the schooner Bellevoire. Its crew of 12 was last sighted off Ocracoke Inlet. Witnesses described an eerie fog rolling in from the east, though no storm was forecast. Within minutes, the vessel vanished. The wreck was never found, and the Coast Guard listed all souls aboard as drowned. But in the fishing villages, people swore otherwise. They claimed the fog had carried with it the faint tolling of a bell and a black silhouette moving against the wind, and even in recent decades the curse persists. In 2008, 2 young divers out of Beaufort disappeared less than a mile from shore. Their gear was found floating, tanks half full. One of the divers, it turned out, bore the surname Harridan, a name traced back to one of the clerks who signed Thorne's sentence into record. Coincidence piles upon coincidence, until the line between chance and intent collapses. Every lost crew, every missing sailor, every inexplicable vanishing echoes the fate of Thorne's own prisoners. Bound, silenced, erased. It is as if the captain of the phantom ship is still recruiting, still expanding his ranks. And this is the darkest truth of all. Ezekiel Thorne's crew is no longer 42. It grows and it waits. There are stories of vanishings, yes. But even more unnerving are the rare testimonies from those who did not vanish. Those who somehow stumbled into the orbit of Ezekiel Thorne's ship, saw its crew with their own eyes, and survived to tell the tale. Their accounts are fragmented, feverish, often dismissed as hallucinations. Yet across time, they align with eerie precision. One such tale comes from 1924. A merchant sailor named Calvin Brewer was found drifting on a lifeboat off Cape Fear, raving about faces in the mist. When he regained his senses, Brewer described being boarded by a vessel that appeared, carved from smoke, yet solid beneath the feet. He swore the men who seized his ship had no eyes, only hollow sockets glowing with a dim blue fire. He alone was spared for reasons he never understood. The rest of his crew, never found. Then in 1979, a yachtsman named Harold Pierce filed a shaken report after a night sail turned into horror. He and two friends encountered a black silhouette of a brigantine where no such vessel should have been. Pierce described its sails as ragged, yet billowing against the wind. He claimed ghostly figures lined its deck. Not men, but empty skins draped in tattered coats. A lantern swung at the bow, and with it, the sound of iron chains dragging across wood. His friends insisted it was imagination. But the next morning, those same friends were gone from their bunks. Their bodies were never recovered, and in the early 2000s, a shrimp boat out of Charleston brought back a deckhand half mad with terror. He babbled of being watched. In the night fog, he described voices calling his name, not in sound, but inside his skull. He said the crew who appeared on the phantom deck were not strangers, but bore the faces of his own ancestors, pale and drowned, their lips mouthing one command, "Join us." Such testimonies are easy to dismiss when heard alone, but when placed side by side, a pattern emerges: the same fog, the same ragged sails, the same hollow-eyed crew reaching for the living as though recruiting them. And perhaps most chilling of all, the survivors always carry something back, not just memories but scars. One bore rope burns though he swore no rope touched him. Another carried salt water in his lungs though he never drowned. It is as if Thorne allows them to live, only to serve as heralds of what waits offshore. For generations, governments have denied the existence of Ezekiel Thorne's ship. The official stance remains unchanged: maritime accidents, storms, human error, nothing more. But beneath the surface, buried in restricted files and sealed naval logs, evidence tells another story, one that institutions refuse to admit publicly. The U.S. Navy's own declassified reports reveal disturbing anomalies. In 1943, during World War II, a patrol destroyer reported chasing an unidentified vessel off the Carolina coast. Radar picked up the target, yet when visual confirmation came, the officers described two-masted brig, 18th century design, running without lights. They attempted radio contact, no response. Moments later, the vessel simply vanished from both sight and radar. The report was stamped UNXPIND and filed away. In 1956, the Coast Guard recorded a string of distress calls from fishermen near Hatteras. One transmission still sends chills: "We are being boarded. They have no eyes, God help us." The call ended abruptly, never resumed. The boat was later found adrift, nets torn, deck splintered, with no crew aboard. The official report listed it as equipment failure. Privately, the investigator scribbled one line in the margin: "This is the Thorne case again." Even NASA's satellites have captured strange anomalies along the Carolina coastline. Between 1998 and 2003, at least 4 separate images recorded a black shape resembling a brigantine, cutting through fog banks where no vessel had been registered. Experts dismissed it as sensor error, but those who studied the legend saw confirmation. And perhaps most damning of all is the testimony of retired Coast Guard Commander Daniel Mercer, who broke silence in a 1997 interview. Mercer claimed that recruits are quietly warned of the ghost brig during training, not officially, but as a whispered caution. He admitted that the Coast Guard has logged hundreds of unexplained vanishings in the same 60-mile stretch of ocean where Thorne was last seen. "We don't write it in the books," Mercer said, "but every man who's been out there knows. You see the fog roll in at night, you get out. If you don't come back." These fragments, scattered across agencies, suggest something chilling. Those in power know the curse of Ezekiel Thorne endures. But they bury the truth, fearing panic, or perhaps fearing something worse. Because what they can't explain, they can't control, and what they can't control is still hunting. While navies and coast guards attempt to bury the truth, local families along the Carolina coast carry a much darker burden. For them, the curse of Ezekiel Thorne is not an abstract legend. It is a shadow passed down through generations, an inheritance of fear. These are the descendants of the men who once jailed Thorne and his crew, the sheriffs, judges, and jailers who believed they had secured the pirate's end. In Beaufort, there is a family whose name I will not speak here, for they begged anonymity. Their great-great-grandfather served as a guard at the jailhouse where Thorne was held before his mysterious disappearance. In hushed tones, the family admits that every generation since has suffered unexplained vanishings. Sons lost at sea, daughters drowned in rivers, fathers who went out on fishing boats and never returned. They call it Thorne's Toll. and they speak of it with a grim acceptance, as if it is a debt that can never be paid. In Charleston, another bloodline traces back to the very magistrate who signed the order to execute Thorne. His descendants claim to be haunted by dreams of a faceless man in a tattered coat who watches them from the foot of their beds. One woman described waking to find seawater pooled around her floorboards, though her home sat miles inland. She believed it was a warning, a reminder that her family's role in Thorne's capture had marked them forever. And then there are the families who have left the coast entirely, fleeing inland in hopes of breaking free. Yet even they are not spared. A man from Tennessee, descended from a Beaufort jailer, claimed his son disappeared during a camping trip beside a mountain lake. The boy was never found, but weeks later the father received a call in the dead of night. On the other end was the sound of creaking timbers, flapping sails, and distant voices chanting in unison, "Join us." What unites these stories is not proof, but persistence. Too many families whisper the same refrain: Thorne takes what he is owed. The curse is not bound by geography, it is bound by blood. And that may explain why these families rarely speak to outsiders. They live in quiet dread, passing the warnings to their children: never trust the fog, never follow the sound of chains, and never, under any circumstances, look into the eyes of the crew. Patterns are the enemy of denial. A random accident can be explained away. A freak storm, a shipwreck, human error, all can be written off. But when those accidents occur again and again, each echoing the same date, the same place, and the same circumstances, denial becomes impossible. The disappearances tied to Ezekiel Thorne follow a chilling rhythm. It begins with September, the month of his vanishing in 1714. Records show that nearly every decade since, ships have gone missing during that same stretch of late summer to early autumn. The losses cluster around the Carolina coast, a strip of sea notorious for its shoals and storms, but too many cases bear hallmarks that natural disasters cannot explain. In 1814, exactly 100 years after Thorne's escape, a merchant vessel named Providence vanished with 38 men aboard. Its last log entry described an unnatural fog bank rising from calm seas. Survivors? None. Wreckage? None. Only the logbook, found floating days later, its final page soaked in brine. In 1914, another 100 years later, a U.S. naval training ship disappeared during routine exercises. The official report blamed mechanical failure, but whispers spread quickly among sailors. Men on nearby ships claimed to have seen black sails slicing through the fog, pursuing the vessel before it blinked out of existence. The Navy suppressed those accounts, but privately officers called it the Thorne anniversary. And in 2014, the curse struck again. A modern fishing trawler, Carolina Belle, left port with a seasoned crew and top-tier navigation equipment. It vanished within a 40-mile radius of the same coastal waters. The Coast Guard searched for weeks, deploying sonar and helicopters. Nothing was found. No wreck, no debris, no oil slick. Just silence. The date, September 12th, precisely 300 years to the day since Thorne's disappearance. Locals mark these anniversaries with dread. Some refuse to sail in September, passing down the superstition as unshakable truth. The sea remembers, they say, and the sea collects its toll. If the pattern holds, and history suggests it will, the next great vanishing is not far off. The cycle does not weaken with time. If anything, it grows bolder, as if Thorne's shadow tightens its grip with each passing century. Which raises the most terrifying question of all: is the curse building towards something final? A return, a reckoning, a storm not of weather but of vengeance. For centuries, sailors have been the unwilling chroniclers of Ezekiel Thorne's afterlife. Most are reluctant to speak for fear of ridicule. But in smoky taverns on weather-beaten docks, and in journals never meant for public eyes, their words converge into a disturbing chorus. They speak of the ship that should not be there. One fisherman from Beaufort, interviewed in the 1920s, claimed he encountered a vessel at dawn while pulling in his nets. The waters had been calm, the horizon clear. Then, without warning, a fog swallowed his boat. Out of that haze emerged a towering silhouette, a galleon with blackened sails, sails that did not flutter despite the wind. The figurehead, he said, looked half human, half skeletal, its wooden face locked in a snarl. And on deck, motionless, stood men in chains. They watched him, their eyes hollow, their skin pale as moonlight. He fled, abandoning his nets. For the rest of his life, he would not sail in September. In 1959, a British cargo ship passing through the Carolinas logged a sighting. The entry, later censored, described an antiquated warship bearing no flag, no lights, moving against the wind. Crew members reported hearing metallic clanging like shackles dragged across wood, followed by distant chanting. Within minutes, the ship vanished into mist as if swallowed whole. The captain, a practical man, insisted the log be kept. Weeks later, he was court-martialed for fabricating false reports. His career never recovered. But perhaps the most chilling account comes from a Coast Guard officer in 2003. During a routine patrol, his vessel picked up a radar contact. The shape was massive, inconsistent with any modern craft. When they closed in, all instruments failed. Compasses spun, radios screamed static. Then, emerging from the fog, they saw it a hulking shadow with sails tattered like torn flesh. Through binoculars, the officer swore he saw faces pressed against the rails, faces twisted not in rage but in silent pleading. As if begging for release, he filed his report, but it was sealed. Only in retirement did he dare speak, his voice trembling as he confessed, "That ship is real, and it's still hunting." And these testimonies cannot be dismissed as mass delusion. Too many match, separated by oceans of time, black sails, shackled crew, silent eyes, always in September, always near the Carolina coast, always vanishing before pursuit. The question isn't whether sailors see Thorne's ship. The question is, why does it reveal itself only to some? The selective nature of the sightings has haunted researchers for generations. Why does Ezekiel Thorne's phantom ship reveal itself to fishermen, to cargo crews, to lone patrol officers, but never to an armada, never to fleets prepared for war? Why these isolated souls scattered across centuries? Theories divide into two grim camps. The first holds that Thorne's crew appear only to those who carry a mark, not visible, not physical, but spiritual. Men and women bound to the same fate, whether by ancestry, by guilt, or by secret bloodlines. Some folklorists point to the 42 prisoners taken in 1714. Many were never formally identified, their families scattered across colonies, islands, and continents. What if their descendants unknowingly sailed the same waters today? What if the ghostly ship reveals itself as a cruel reminder, or a summons, to kin of the lost? The second theory cuts deeper. Witnesses are not chosen by blood, but by weakness. Accounts reveal a pattern. The fisherman was near financial ruin. The cargo captain's crew faced mutiny. The Coast Guard officer confessed to sleepless nights of guilt. Each was vulnerable. Each carried cracks in the armor of their spirit, and into those cracks the silence of Thorne's crew seeped like seawater. To see them, some say, is not a chance encounter. It is an invitation. Invitations, after all, require responses. And witnesses who see the ship rarely escape unchanged. The Beaufort fisherman abandoned the sea. The British captain drank himself into ruin. The Coast Guard officer lived out his days reclusive, muttering about chains in the dark. It raises a chilling possibility. The ship is not merely a wandering spectre. It is recruiting. Imagine it. Across centuries, Ezekiel Thorne sails the same haunted corridor, appearing not to all, but to those who might be swayed. The lonely, the broken, the desperate. What if every sighting is not a haunting but a test? Some resist and crumble. Perhaps others accept the invitation. If true, then the number of souls chained aboard has not remained fixed at 42. It has grown slowly, quietly, each century adding new faces to the ranks of the damned. And if that is so, then the ship is not bound to the past. It is building a future. For centuries, the sightings of Thorne's phantom ship followed a grimly predictable pattern: terror, obsession, and decline. Yet, in the past 100 years, the stories have shifted. It is no longer enough for the ship to appear. Now the witnesses themselves are vanishing. The earliest case surfaced in 1927 in Charleston. A dockworker named Elias Carter reported to friends that he had seen black sails without wind on the horizon. He told the tale for 3 nights running in the taverns by the waterfront, his voice cracking with fear, his hands trembling as though chilled to the bone. On the 4th night, he was gone, his bed unslept in, his belongings untouched. The only trace left behind was a sailor's knot tied tightly around the post of his bunk, a knot used only for shackling prisoners. The pattern repeated in 1962. A pair of brothers shrimpers out of Beaufort radioed in distress a ship was bearing down on them, though radar showed no contact. Their last words were chilling. "They're waving us aboard." By the time rescue arrived, the boat drifted empty. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just 2 coffee mugs on the deck, still warm. And in 1999, a woman named Sarah Langley, an amateur historian, claimed she had traced her ancestry to one of Thorne's 42 prisoners. She spent months investigating coastal archives and made one last entry in her journal. "They've found me. The ship waits. I hear the chains." She was never seen again. Her apartment door was locked from the inside, the lights still on. Her journal lay open on the desk, the ink of that final sentence smeared as though written in haste. These are not accidents. These are not coincidences. Witnesses are not simply seeing the ship anymore. They are being claimed by it. Skeptics dismiss these accounts as myth layered upon myth. But skeptics cannot explain the knots, the warm mugs, the journals written in terror. Skeptics cannot explain the missing bodies. If the ship is indeed recruiting, then these vanishings are the proof. Thorne's crew is not static. It grows slowly, silently, piece by piece, sailor by sailor, century by century. And if the silence of those chained men still echoes across the waves, it is louder now than ever before. The question is no longer whether Ezekiel Thorne's ship exists. Too many accounts, too many vanishings, too many coincidences have piled like driftwood against the rocks of disbelief. The question now is simpler and far more terrifying. Why does it continue? 3 centuries have passed since Thorne vanished with 42 prisoners chained in his hold. By the laws of time and nature, his bones should be dust. His ship should be rotted timber buried beneath sand and sea. Yet it sails still, not bound to history, but bound to hunger. Every witness's testimony whispers the same warning. The ship is not a relic, it is a predator. It stalks the lonely corridors of the Carolina coast, appearing only to those whose spirits are weakened, whose defenses are cracked. And when it reveals itself, it does not simply vanish back into legend. It watches, it waits, it chooses. The vanishings of Elias Carter in 1927, of the Beaufort brothers in 1962, of Sarah Langley in 1999, they are not isolated tragedies. They are proof of an unbroken chain, each disappearance adding another link. Each soul taken bolstering the crew below decks. Imagine it now in the darkness of the hold, among the clinking shackles. The silence is no longer held by the original 42. No, new faces are there. New voices swallowed by silence. Carter, the brothers, Langley, perhaps dozens more whose names were never recorded. And here is the final horror. Legends tell that the ship sails closest when its story is told. That by speaking of Ezekiel Thorne and his vanished crew, you call their silence nearer. That by listening, by letting the tale settle into your thoughts, you place yourself upon their horizon. So ask yourself, why you? Why here? Why now? You did not stumble upon this story by accident. You chose to hear it. And if Thorne is still recruiting, if his cursed vessel still drags new souls into the black water, then perhaps tonight it waits for you. The horizon is dark, the waves whisper, and in the silence, the chains are rattling. If you felt the chill of this story, subscribe for more tales buried in the shadows of history. Leave a comment below, but beware. Every word you write might be another knock upon Thorne's door.